Well, good morning, church. We are glad you are here this morning. If you're visiting with us, we are especially thankful you are here this morning. Those of you watching online, we're so grateful that you've tuned in. Invitations are important. I love to get invitations. I got an invitation in the mail just yesterday for a wedding that I'm the one doing the wedding. So I was appreciative to get that, to be reminded, hey, I'm supposed to do this wedding for you in a little while. But our BF2C, our Bring a Friend to Church Sunday, is just a month away. It's going to be on Sunday, September 25th. Last Sunday of the month, next month, and we have some invitations for you. So on the table in the family room, just through the double doors on the other side of the hall, there are these invitations. Now feel free to take, whether it's just the invitation you can hand to somebody, or we do have the envelopes that you can throw an address on there and put that in the mail, and it just give you an extra tool, another way to invite friends and family to our Bring a Friend to Church Sunday. It's a great event. I look forward to it every year. I look forward to going down to the lake afterwards because we always have a really good time down there. We have a great meal planned down there this year, a lot of fun games, and it's just a great time of fellowship. But more importantly, it's an opportunity for you to bring someone to church that maybe you've been meaning to ask them for some time now. You haven't been real sure exactly how to bring the topic up, and here's an easy way. Hey, guess what? We're having a Bring a Friend to Church Sunday on September 25th, and I don't want to be the only one who doesn't have a friend there. Would you come with me? You know? And I think this will be one of our biggest, best years ever, and I'm really looking forward to it. I read a story that comes out of Charlotte, North Carolina, and it was about this lawyer who had got these 24 very rare, very expensive cigars. And he took out an insurance policy, a very expensive insurance policy, against these very rare cigars for fire damage and, of course, other incidental things that might happen to these things. Before he even made his very first payment, he decided to smoke the 24 cigars, and he filed a claim against the insurance, claiming that his 24 cigars had been destroyed by, and I quote, a series of small fires. Well, of course, the insurance company denied the claim. But then, him being a good lawyer, he did what a good lawyer would do, and he sued the insurance company. He said, hey, the paperwork says that you will insure these against any fire. They were in a fire and destroyed. I want my money. And what's even more crazy is not only did he sue, but the first trial that went to, the first judge, in reading the paperwork and the loopholes of the paper, he said, hey, he's right. You guys owe him $15,000 for these rare cigars. Now, rather than pay the fines and the fees and the law costs and the court costs of taking this to appeals, the insurance company just relented and sent him a check for $15,000. But the story doesn't end there. After this lawyer cashed the $15,000 check from the insurance company, they filed 24 counts of arson against the client. He was arrested, sentenced to 24 months in jail, and a $24,000 fine. So, well, there's someone who thought he was preparing for his future. He had a good plan for tomorrow, but it didn't really work out all that well. Last week, I preached a sermon that we called the grasshopper myth. And it was looking at the children of Israel about to enter into the promised land, but when they saw the people in the promised land, they felt like in their own eyes, to how big these people were, they were just too small. So they could not cross over. Even though God had told them, even though God had promised to be with them, they felt that they could not cross over because they were too small. And the problem wasn't that they were too small. The problem was thinking they were too small was a problem. Does that make sense? It was the fact that they didn't have this faith and trust in this great God. So for 40 years, they wandered the desert until the next generation with Joshua and Caleb are able to lead them over. But in our story today, since last week we talked about grasshoppers, I thought today we'd talk about frogs, right? And the reason I say that is the acronym that you've seen go around for FROG, fully rely on God. Because when they get over into the promised land, they start to conquer and they start to decide that they have a better plan than God because they're conquering all these people. And God said, just destroy everything. Don't take any of the plunder. Don't take any of the spoils. Don't steal any of their livestock. Don't take any of their gold. Certainly do not take their false idols and fake gods that they worship. But yet there was at least one person in the camp at this time, a story about a guy named Achan, who did steal some of those things. And because there was sin in the camp, the next city they went up against, a small city, a little city called Ai, a city that compared to what they had just done by the walls of Jerusalem falling, or rather Jericho, and taking this big city of Jericho, man, Ai should have been a piece of cake, right? This should have been easy, but yet they were destroyed. So it was because of sin in the camp. And if you look at this first scripture, it's on the top of your outline. It's from what... Debbie's husband. Isn't that horrible? I'm trying to go through something in Debbie. So Jim and Debbie, what Jim read for us this morning, thank you for reading that, Jim. But consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow. God is saying, regardless of the mistake of yesterday, let's consecrate, let's prepare, let's get ready for tomorrow. So this morning, what I want to do, just for a few minutes, if you have your outline, will you hand me my outline, Sam? If you got your bulletin this morning, inside of this, there's an outline. Now, this has some blanks and some scriptures, some things to help you follow along. And I want to share with you what it means to fully rely on God as we think about preparing for tomorrow. And this is something that I think is applicable for you at your job, for you in your relationships, and especially for us as a church in our walk with God. So on your outline, I'm going to give you 4 mistakes to avoid when preparing for tomorrow, and then what it looks like when we are truly being a frog and fully relying on God for tomorrow. So on your outline, number 1, here's the first mistake to avoid. Avoid useless worry. Avoid useless worrying. I talked to a guy the other day at the American Legion, older gentleman, Korea War veteran, in his 80s now, and he had shared with me that there were so many things that he was so worried sick about in his life that caused him so much pain and trouble. And he said most of the things that he worried about the most were things that never would happen, right? That they were just this, I'm so worried that this might happen and it not happen, and he would waste his time worrying about it. And as we're thinking about, whether it's for you individually or for us as a church, when we think about preparing for tomorrow, useless worry is not a wise way to consecrate and prepare yourself for tomorrow. You know, say, oh, what's going to happen with the government? What's going to happen with this new law? What's going to happen if gas prices go up again? What's going to happen with, and we spend so much time focused on worry that we're unable to plan. We're unable to prepare for tomorrow because we get so stuck in the worry. Now, Jesus often warned us about the foolishness of worry. You know, worry never, it's impossible for worry to change the past. It rarely can affect the future. And most of the time, all it does is just destroy your now, right? It just makes you miserable in the present. So Jesus says this in Matthew 6 on your outline. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his life, right? We live in a time that people are really concerned about living longer. I mean, the health food industry, the health care, exercise. My grandfather used to say that if you exercise every day and you eat right and you don't drink, smoke, cuss, or chew, that you could add 20 years to your life in a nursing home. And who wants that, right? I mean, but we do. We live in a time that's concerned about how can I add more onto my life? And the point Jesus is saying here is that worry is worthless. We worry about many things that are just, it's useless. Because here's the facts. If there is something in my life that I'm worried about that I can change, it is silly, foolish, and worthless to worry about it because I can change it, right? If I have control over it and I could change it rather than worry about it, I'm going to change it. Now, if it is something in my life that I absolutely have zero control over, there is nothing I could do to change it, then guess what? Worry is worthless because there's nothing I could do to change it. Doesn't that make sense? See, if we need to avoid useless worry. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do know this. God says he's the one in control of the future. I put this on your outline. Or on the big screen, rather. I didn't put it on your outline. But in that same passage in Matthew chapter 6, if you go on to read, look what Jesus says in verses 30 through 33. And if you're the kind of person that you really struggle with worry, this is a good passage to take to heart. This is one you ought to write down. Don't have so little faith, Jesus says. Don't worry and say, well, what will we eat? What will we drink? What will we wear? The people, now look what he says here. The people who do not know God keep trying to get these things. And your Father in heaven, who knows you need them. He says the thing you should want the most is God's kingdom and doing what God wants. Then all these other things will be given to you. Jesus says that if we spend time in worry, and I'm not talking about like legitimate concerns. I'm not talking about your mom wants you to wear your galoshes when it's raining outside, right? I'm talking about these people who just, like almost a crippling, like a debilitating worry of, oh, what's going to happen to our government? What's going to happen to the country? What's going to happen to the church? I mean, look at this. What do you mean what's going to happen to the church? It will be victorious, period, right? So the people who get so caught up in that, Jesus says basically what you're doing is you are acting like an atheist if you allow worry to control your life. See what he says there? It's like someone who doesn't even believe that God's in control. So as we are preparing for tomorrow, avoid useless worry. Instead, fill in this next blank. Instead, trust God and make each day count. Make each day count. When Jesus, and I know you know this, but when Jesus' apostles, when his disciples, when his followers comes up to him in the Gospels and they said, Lord, John's disciples were taught how to pray by John. Would you teach us how to pray? And Jesus said, yes. When you pray, pray like this. And then he recites this little prayer that many of us have memorized. Some of you may have come from a faith tradition where at some point in the service, you would repeat together this prayer. When I speak at the chapel services over at the Solstice, used to be called the Vintage, right here in town, part of their tradition, we say the Lord's Prayer together. So, our Father which art in heaven, you always had to memorize it in the King James, right? Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day. Jesus is very careful and purposeful in the words he chose when he said, here's how you pray. Give us this day our yearly bread. Text didn't say that. Give us this day our monthly bread. I mean, just take care of the month. He doesn't say that. Well, give us this day our weekly bread. I mean, at least get me through the week. He doesn't say that. What does it say? You've memorized this prayer. Give us this day our what? Our daily bread, right? Live in the day. And because every one of us, every one of you sitting here, everyone watching online, we're all one breath and one heartbeat away from eternity anyway. So let's live for today, plan for today, and as we're preparing for tomorrow, don't allow useless worry to be something that totally takes us out of what God has planned for us today. Number 2, here's another thing to avoid. And this is the extreme opposite of useless worry. Arrogant assuming. Arrogant assuming. Now, like I said, this is like this is the extreme opposite from those who are just, useless worriers, right? The worrier goes off the deep end on the negative side. The arrogant person goes off, the arrogant assumer, they go off the deep end on the positive side, right? It's like the song that was popular in the 80s, Don't worry, be happy. Yeah, great song, poor theology, right? I mean, not the best way to live. Or who was the popular Jamaican Bob Marley, right? Every little thing's going to what? It's all going to be all right, right? Yeah. The problem is what the world says is everything's all right. What the world calls happy and what God promises us in his word is not always the same thing, right? They don't always line up the same way. And everything will be all right. Just have positive thoughts. Just if you just think it and you name it, and then you can claim it, right? I mean, that's some stuff that's being taught out there right now. In fact, there's a popular a preacher and author whose name I won't mention, but he wrote a book about you can have your best life now. It was a big seller. And in it, basically what he says is, if you just think positive thoughts, if you just have a good frame of mind, if you just think that you will be blessed, if you just think that you will be rich, if you could just know, then this life will be there. And I'm sitting there reading this stuff and I'm thinking, man, if the best life I can have is now, we're in trouble, right? Because there's a best life yet to come. There's a more important life that's yet to come. And people who get caught up in this idea of just arrogantly assuming, well, the proverb writer says it this way. Did I put this on your outline? Proverbs 27, verse 1. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. We cannot make arrogant assumptions about tomorrow as we are preparing for tomorrow. Here's another one. I didn't put this on your outline, but I did put it on the screen for you. The brother of Jesus talks about it this way. He says, why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. As it is, you boast and brag, and all such boasting is evil. James is making the point that life is just unpredictable. That this life is just, it's a mist, this translation says. Another translation says it's like a vapor. The Greek word there is atom, so it's where we get our word atmosphere, right? And so it's just Shakespeare, in his famous line in Macbeth, talks about how life is like a candle, right? It struts and fruts its hour upon the stage, and then it is heard no more. You know? I mean, this life is just something that is short. We're not guaranteed our very next breath, and having an arrogant assumption as we are preparing for tomorrow can cause trouble. I didn't put this on your outline or the screen, but Proverbs 22, verse 23 says, a prudent man foresees difficulties and prepares for them. The simpleton goes on blindly and suffers the consequences. So here's a better way. Instead of arrogant assuming, instead, trust God and prepare. Trust God and prepare. Prepare for tomorrow. To fully rely on God does not mean I sit back and do nothing, right? I have faith, God will take care of it. Sometimes faith, God will take care of it means he's going to use you to be the mode that he takes care of it with, and you need to step out in faith and do what God is calling you to do, right? Not making arrogant assumptions about tomorrow, not being just totally, disabled because I'm so worried about what tomorrow may be, but rather trusting in God, making the most of every day, and preparing for tomorrow. So then that leads to number 3 then. The third thing to avoid as we're thinking about preparing tomorrow is faulty planning. Faulty planning, poor planning. Have you ever been a victim of poor planning? Can you look back on things in your life that you wish you would have planned out just a little bit better? Let me share with you a perfect example of this that really hit home, at least for me and Christine, because of our love for Taco Bell. In fact, I think me and Christine and Kristen are going to go to Taco Bell tonight to talk about some fellowships coming up, or today. But anyway, Taco Bell, during the COVID shutdown, they took off one of the most popular items on their menu, the Mexican pizza, right? And at that time, people thought, well, it's just because of the pandemic. It's just because of, that they're trying to make their menu less complex, so it'll be easier. At that time, dining rooms were shut down, so you could only go through drive-thrus. But really, what has been revealed since then is this was actually a marketing scheme. This was actually a marketing plan that they were purposefully pulling that from the menu just for a small amount of time, and then, of course, COVID hit. And then they were going to re-release it with the excitement of, hey, it's back, back, right? And it would really sell. The problem is they didn't realize how well it would really sell when it came back in May of 22 this year, just a few months ago. Right? It came back and it became the most popular item selling on the menu, selling up to 17 times more than when it was on the menu originally, to the point that within the first 2 weeks, they ran out nationwide of the stuff that they need to make a Mexican pizza. And right now, you still can't go get a Mexican pizza at Taco Bell. Now, September 15th, they're claiming it's going to come back, right? Poor planning, right? Faulty planning. And sometimes that can get us in trouble spiritually as well. Again, James, the brother of Jesus, in James 4. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this city or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Now, you read that and you think, well, Chad, what's wrong with that? I mean, you just said above that we shouldn't have arrogant assuming. So we ought to prepare and make plans. So what's wrong with what he's saying here? That's a good business plan. That's the way to prepare. And there's nothing wrong with planning. There's certainly nothing wrong with preparing. I think it's biblical. But do you notice that in that text, the person that James is quoting says nothing about God in their plan? No mention of God at all. And there are many people in this room, there are many people listening online, and there's even one who's talking to you right now that has been guilty of making plans and planning my schedule without thinking about where God falls in that. That's a problem. We don't consult God. If we do, it's very little, or sometimes it's an afterthought when it comes to planning our future, our finances, our whatever. When it comes to facing major decisions in life, we don't seek God out in prayer. We make plans for the church. We're going to have a bring a friend to church Sunday, then we're going to do walk for water this year, and then we're going to do, and often we're guilty of not including God in it. We say we're Christians, but we live as if God's not even a real part of our life other than showing up for an hour on a Sunday morning. Planning for the future is great, but planning without prayer, planning without God is presumption. Because what we're saying is, I don't need God. Don't go through life without consulting God. And if you do, that's going to cause problems, especially as we're thinking about preparing for tomorrow. I didn't put it on your outline, but Ecclesiastes 8:7 says that since no man knows the future, who can tell him what is to come? We have no idea what the future is, but we know the one who does, right? Have you ever noticed, I put this on the screen, have you ever noticed in the word life, there's a really big if right in the middle of life? You ever notice that? A big if. We don't know. And so James says a more proper way, a more Christian way, a better way to plan and prepare for the future is by making this statement, James 4:15. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will do this or that, right? My grandmother say that all the time. So I say, Bonnie, you going to be such and such place tomorrow? She said, well, Lord willing. And usually she added, and the creek don't rise, right? Which in my part of the country, that was literal, because if you flush your toilet twice, the creek in our backyard would flood, and there we'd be. It's actually... You know what's interesting? You look up the etymology of that phrase. That actually goes back to like the Western Plain times of like the Old West and the Creek Indians. Yeah, as long as the Creek Indians don't rise up, we'll plan to do what we need to do for tomorrow. But Jesus says, James, the brother of Jesus rather, says, instead you ought to say, if it's God's will. So write this down. Instead of faulty planning, trust God and then pray as you plan. Pray as you plan. Be sure. I mean, if we are Bible-believing Jesus followers, then prayer should be the first thing we go to before we make any plan in our life. Any major decision, whether it's for the church, whether it's for your marriage, whether it's for your finances, whether it's your job, your school, or anything else, God ought to be the first thing that we consult, the first thought in our minds. And too often, I've heard people, and I know they're well-meaning. I'm not trying to judge any of you if you've ever said this. I'm not trying to step on your toes right now, but I've heard people say things like, well, we've tried everything we can, so all we can do now is what? Pray. As if that's some last-ditch effort. As if, man, and That is just polar opposite of what God teaches in His Word. And there's only one of three ways to do things. You can either just say, okay, I'm just going to completely do this on my own. I can pull myself up in my own bootstraps. I can plan this. I can handle this. Or we do something, and then almost like an afterthought, we start to pray and say, Lord, please bless what we're doing, right? But you know what a better idea is? What if we prayed, Lord, help us to do with your blessing, rather than some afterthought of asking God to bless what we're already doing? And I know you say, Chad, that's semantics. It's not semantics. It's placing God where He belongs. It's saying that this is something that I will bathe in prayer before I make a decision. And I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with, I've made a decision, Lord, please bless this, but how much better, how much wiser is it as I'm preparing for tomorrow if in my planning, and to help me to stop arrogant or rather useless worrying, and to avoid some of this arrogant assuming, that I spend time in prayer and say, Lord, as I am planning what you want us to do as a church family for the remainder of this year, what you want us to do as a church family, as before we know it, we're going to be going into a new year. Lord, let me do with your blessing. Pray and plan. Pray as you plan. One more, number 4. Here's another mistake to avoid when preparing for tomorrow is lazy procrastinating. Lazy procrastinating. Finish this sentence. Why do today what you can put off till tomorrow, right? Yeah, that's something a lot of us like to live by. I'm right there. Now, my Irish grandfather used to say, what is today but yesterday's tomorrow, right? I mean, putting things off, procrastinating can be a poor way to prepare for tomorrow. I'm old enough, and I think almost everybody in this room is probably old enough to remember the whole Y2K scare. Do you remember that? Oh no. I mean, when it becomes the year 2000, the computers aren't going to know what to do because everything's just going to blow up. And there's probably somebody in a bunker still today in central West Virginia, that hasn't realized it. But I mean, I read an article that we meaning like the tech company, and of course it obviously was not the big deal they made it out to be, but there were some issues. I mean, there were some things that happened because they weren't prepared, but they knew about it back in the 80s. They just kept putting off doing something about it. And have you ever noticed, maybe this is just me, but help me feel like this is not just me. Have you ever noticed when you put things off, something you know you need to do, it tends to make it worse? Anybody else ever notice that? Have you ever had like a tooth issue that you put off? Anybody ever put off going to the dentist, right? I did that once. I had a tooth one time that was bugging me. I'm like, I don't want to go to the dentist. And I put it off, and I put it off, and I put it off, and I ended up losing the tooth only because I didn't go in as soon as it started bothering me. Had I went in right away, he's like, oh yeah, we could have just done this. It would have been fixed. Now I could. I'll never forget this. Christine and I were young married. I wasn't military yet. We didn't have any kind of health insurance. We were making just very little bit of money, living off of student loans and what little bit of money we made at that time. And I had this tooth problem, the one I'm talking about. Went to the dentist finally, and he's like, okay, listen, here's what we could do. We could do a root canal, and it might save the tooth. I'm like, well, how much will that cost? And it was some ridiculous, it'd be like $2,000 if you're just paying out of pocket. He goes, or I could pull the tooth for like 69 cents. I'm like, all right, pull the tooth, I guess. I mean, I didn't feel like I had any option. But when you put things off, when you know there's something you need to deal with, when you know there's a problem you need to handle, but you really don't want to do it because of lazy procrastination, it causes more problems than what it's worth. So again, the brother of Jesus talks about this in James 4:17. He says, anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. So if you put off what you know you need to do, if there's something that you have read in God's word that you know you ought to do, and you're just like, I just don't want to do it yet, I'm just not ready for it, I'm going to put that up. God says that's sin. He says it's sin. And some of us live our life. It was like the poem that somebody wrote one time. He said, procrastination is my sin. It only brings me sorrow. I know I ought to change my ways. I think I will tomorrow, right? Lazy procrastination. The Bible says you can literally sin by doing nothing. Look at Proverbs 3 on the screen here. Do not withhold good from those who deserve it when it's in your power to act. Do not say to your neighbor, come back later. I'll give it to you tomorrow, when you now have it with you. God says if you know it's something you need to do, then do it now. So on your outline, fill in this last blank. Instead of lazy procrastination, let's trust God and then just do it. Just do it. If you know this is God's will for your life, if you know this is something you've been meaning to do, stop putting it off and do it, because delayed obedience is disobedience, right? Delayed obedience is disobedience. And so my question for you, in your walk with God, in your marriage, in your finances, in your whatever aspect of your life, for us as a church, what is it that we know God has been calling us to do that we've been putting off? And this last scripture that Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 6, Paul says, I tell you, now is the time of God's favor, and now is the day of salvation. Some of you, maybe you've been putting off being baptized. You know you ought to do it. You just been, I'm going to, well, then do it now, right? Because the best way to prepare for tomorrow is to do now what God would have you to do. When it comes to preparing for tomorrow, there's a lot of mistakes that we should avoid. Useless worry, arrogant assuming, faulty and poor planning, lazy procrastination. But fully relying on God means we trust God and we make each day count. We trust God and we prepare for tomorrow. But as we trust God and prepare for tomorrow, we pray as we plan. We ask that we might do with God's blessing rather than just asking God to bless what we're doing. And then we do it. If we know we ought to do it, we do it. That's how you consecrate yourself in preparation for tomorrow. Let me pray for you. Lord, I ask a blessing upon everyone here. I just ask that you would